It is August 1945. The Axis powers are on the verge of defeat. Only one remains: Japan. However, the land of the rising sun has no intention of surrendering. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the island, is about to be launched, but with over 1 million casualties expected, the President of the United States turns to a secret weapon, the most powerful bomb ever made. The order is given, and on the 6th and 9th of August 1945, the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are reduced to ashes. The president's name? Harry Truman, the man who dropped the bomb. The man known to history as Harry Truman was born Harry S. Truman on the 8th of May 1884 in Lamar, Missouri, a village 120 miles south of Kansas City. Harry's ancestors on both sides of his family migrated to Missouri from Kentucky. His paternal grandfather, Anderson Ship Truman, had taken the journey on horseback in 1846. Harry's father, John Anderson Truman, was born in 1851 and spent most of his life working as a farmer and animal trader. Although he was known as an aggressive businessman, John Truman was a docile father who enjoyed singing while his wife accompanied him at the piano. Harry's mother, Martha Ellen Young, married John Truman in December 1881. The Young family had arrived in Missouri in 1841, and Harry's grandfather, Solomon Young, acquired thousands of acres of land over the years. Missouri was one of 4 slave-holding states which did not secede from the Union during the American Civil War, but the Young farm was raided on several occasions by Union troops between 1861 and 1863. Martha was not yet 9 years old during the first raid and harbored resentment towards East Coast Northerners for the rest of her life. In 1868, at the age of 17, she was sent to Lexington Baptist Female College. After 2 years studying music and art, the outspoken Martha was rarely inclined to help out in the farm or the house, even after she married John Truman and moved to their newly built house at Lamar. After a stillborn child in the autumn of 1882, Martha gave birth to Harry, named after her brother Harrison Young, in May 1884. The parents could not agree on which of their fathers to honor with Harry's middle name, and instead compromised with S, which could stand for Solomon or Ship, but actually stood for nothing. Harry Truman's earliest years involved a lot of moving. The family relocated on several occasions as John Truman struggled to make a living. In 1887, the Trumans moved to the Young farm near Grandview to the south of Kansas City, where John took over a 600-acre tract and helped his father-in-law, Solomon Young, manage an adjacent 1,000-acre plot. In April 1886, the family had already welcomed the birth of another son, John Vivian Truman, known to the family simply as Vivian. Then, in August 1889, Martha gave birth to a daughter named Mary Jane, who became Harry's closest childhood companion. Despite a near-death experience at the age of 4 when he swallowed the stone of a peach, Harry recalled his time at the young farm fondly, either running around with his brother among the pastures and meadows, or playing chess and card games with his Uncle Harrison. During the 4th of July celebrations in 1889, the family noticed that Harry reacted enthusiastically to the sound of the fireworks exploding, but paid little attention to the display. Terrified that her son was going blind, Martha Truman took Harry to an eye doctor in Kansas City who diagnosed flat eyeballs, a form of nearsightedness that required thick glasses to correct. Martha was keen to ensure that her children had a good education, and in 1890 the family moved to the town of Independence in Jackson County, which boasted of the best public schools in the state. Founded in 1827, the town served as an important hub for men and women from the East seeking to make their fortune further west, whether in Oregon, California, or Santa Fe. By the time the Trumans arrived in 1890, the town had long recovered from the ravages of the Civil War and was home to a population of 6,000 people, but it was still overshadowed by Kansas City, a few days' travel away. In the autumn of 1892, Harry was enrolled in the Noland School. There he had few opportunities to play outside, unlike his classmates, as he was required by his mother to help with domestic chores and later worked at a local drugstore. He was prevented from playing baseball as it risked damaging his expensive glasses. Instead, he inherited his mother's love for the piano and played for at least 2 hours each day. Harry's schooling was interrupted in January 1894 when he and Vivian were struck down by diphtheria. His recovery was slow, but when he returned to school in the second half of the year, he not only caught back up quickly with the others, but was allowed to skip 3rd grade and transferred to the Columbian School. Harry received a good education and routinely scored well in mathematics and the humanities. He frequented the town's public library and enjoyed reading about the lives of famous historical figures. He dreamed of becoming a great military leader like Napoleon or Hannibal, and when the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, the 14-year-old Harry Truman and his friends formed a small company of wannabe soldiers. Harry had little interest in politics at this point in his life, but his father was a Democrat, and Harry worked as a page at the Democratic National Convention in Kansas City in 1900, where the populist leader William Jennings Bryan won nomination again to fight a rematch of the 1896 presidential election, which he had lost to Republican William McKinley. After leaving school in 1901, Truman wanted to join the army but found his eyesight was too poor to gain admission. The family was too poor to afford to send him to the University of Missouri, so he enrolled in a commercial college in Kansas City, where he may have studied bookkeeping and typewriting. He was forced to quit in 1902 when his father lost a considerable amount of money speculating on grain. Harry worked briefly in the mailroom of the Kansas City Star, followed by a 6-month stint as a timekeeper at a railroad construction company. In February 1903, he moved to Kansas City and worked for the National Commerce Bank, where his colleagues recognized him as a talented and diligent employee. After a couple of years, he moved to the rival Union National Bank. In addition to learning about finance and economics, Truman encountered the big city for the first time and was drawn to its cultural life. In 1905, the Polish composer and pianist Ignacy Jan Paderewski played to an audience of 6,000 at the Convention Hall. Truman later recalled that after the concert, his piano teacher took him to meet the performer. When Truman spoke of his difficulty in playing a part of Paderewski's Minuet in G, the composer sat down at the piano and gave a demonstration of the required technique for 15 minutes. Harry also attended several performances when the Metropolitan Opera of New York came to town, but found grand opera too intense and preferred theatre and light entertainment. In 1905, after reaching his majority at the age of 21, he enlisted in the Missouri National Guard. He proudly donned the blue uniform when he visited the Young farm. His elderly grandmother looked at him disdainfully and said, "Harry, this is the first time since 1863 that a blue uniform has been in this house. Don't bring it here again." Harry's city life came to an abrupt end in 1906, when his parents' crops failed and he was obliged to return to the Young farm to help them. The large farmhouse in which Harry had lived as a child had burned down in 1893, a year after his grandfather Solomon's death, and his grandmother had erected a far more modest edifice in its place. He spent 11 years working at the farm, most of it alongside his father, until the latter's death in 1914. He was eager to improve the farm's efficiency and read extensively about new agricultural methods and technologies. He was determined to eliminate weeds and practiced crop rotation to improve soil quality. He acquired a horse-drawn plough to replace the old walking plough and routinely worked 12-hour days or longer, particularly so during the harvest. While the family kept a large herd of cows to sell to beef-hungry Kansas City, Harry found cows particularly troublesome, bitterly observing that they would never do, as they were difficult to milk. On one occasion, he and his father spent half an hour chasing down a cow to sell to a prospective buyer, only for John to refuse the sale after weighing the animal. One day in 1913, while Harry was setting a fence post, one of the cows attacked him and broke his leg. After a cholera epidemic in 1912 decimated Truman's pigs, he began the arduous task of vaccinating the surviving hogs. It should be noted that Truman's life up to his 30s, coming from an impoverished background that prevented him from attending an elite university, and spending his 20s running a small farm to support his wider family, was extremely unusual for a figure who would subsequently become President of the United States. Most other 20th century presidents attended Ivy League colleges and then had careers in law, business, academia, or some pursuit of that kind before transitioning into politics. From 1910, most of Truman's time outside the farm was spent courting Bess Wallace, a young lady from Independence whom he had first met when the pair were schoolchildren. Although Harry had his eyes on her ever since, the well-to-do Wallaces moved in elevated social circles, and Truman had few opportunities to socialize with her. In December 1910, Harry was visiting relations in Independence when he saw an empty plate that came from a cake gifted by Bess's mother and had to be returned. He seized the plate and went to return it himself, and was greeted by Bess, who invited him to come inside. From then on, the pair saw each other frequently at weekends, either in Independence or in Kansas City. Harry soon proposed marriage. He was refused graciously, understanding that Bess's mother was unwilling to allow her daughter to marry a man with limited means. He spent the next few years trying to increase his fortune, entering lotteries for land grants in South Dakota and Montana, conjuring up various schemes with Uncle Harrison, before joining a venture to open a zinc mine in Oklahoma in 1914. The operation was unprofitable and he soon cut his losses, but in 1916 he invested $5,000 into an oil exploration project in Kansas, serving as treasurer in the company's Kansas City offices during the winter months. The company sank a 900-foot deep hole looking for oil, but America's entry into the First World War not long afterwards caused a manpower shortage and forced the firm to close its operations. Not long afterwards, a separate oil company would strike it big, drilling at the same location. Truman was entering his mid-30s, and it seemed that his luck would never come good. America's entry into the First World War in April 1917 finally gave Truman the opportunity to join the army. Previously, his poor eyesight had been an impediment, but now the restrictions were being loosened to recruit more men. Although he had given up his duties as an artilleryman in the Missouri Guard in 1911, he helped to reorganize the light artillery batteries into 2 regiments and was soon made first lieutenant in the 129th Field Artillery Regiment. The unit received its training at Camp Doniphan in Oklahoma from its commanding officer, Colonel Carl Clem, a Kansas City man who had graduated from West Point Military Academy in 1907. Truman had particular success running a regimental canteen with a fellow officer and went to great lengths to supply the men with what they wanted. By the spring of 1918, Truman's regiment was ready to depart. They arrived in France on the 13th of April during the German spring offensive against the British and French lines. Despite pleas from Allied commanders, the Commander-in-Chief of the American forces in France, John J. Pershing, insisted that his men be trained properly before seeing action. After 3 months of training, Captain Harry Truman became commander of Battery D in July 1918. He disciplined his men and earned their respect, drilling them so that they could move and operate their guns as effectively as possible. After a baptism of fire in the Vosges Mountains, the battery was present at the Battle of Saint-Mihiel in mid-September, though saw no action. In order to get into position for the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which Pershing launched on the 26th of September, Captain Truman marched his battery under the cover of darkness for over 20 nights. On one occasion, Truman saw an enemy battery getting into position within range and completely overwhelmed it with suppressing fire. When Colonel Clem threatened to court-martial him for firing into another division's sector, Truman challenged him to go ahead. No further action was taken. After being rotated from the line, the battery spent 3 weeks at the Verdun front before the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918, bringing the war to an end. The cessation of hostilities gave the troops time to relax, and in late November, Truman visited Paris before travelling to the Mediterranean coast, visiting Marseille, Nice, and Monaco. A shortage of ships meant that the troops remained on French soil for several months, and Truman had to keep his restless men in good order. He wanted nothing more than to return to Bess, who had finally agreed to marry him before he joined the army. In his letters to her, he wrote that he did not care what President Woodrow Wilson was negotiating at the Paris Peace Conference, but simply wanted to get home now that the fighting was over. Battery D embarked on a steamer in April 1919 and arrived in New York on the 20th. After a parade in Kansas City, the unit was demobilized on the 6th of May 1919. Although Truman had only spent 2 years in uniform, his biographer, Ida Donald, argues that he considered it his most important service to his country, including his presidency. He remained close with his comrades in arms, who gifted him a cup with the inscription Captain Harry S. Truman, presented by the members of Battery D in appreciation of his justice, ability, and leadership. On the 28th of June 1919, Truman married Bess at the Trinity Episcopal Church in Independence. The couple moved into Bess's grandmother's house on 219 Delaware Street, where Bess and her mother had lived since her father's death in 1903. Although the bride and groom were already in their mid-30s, they would be married for 53 years. A month before the wedding, Truman and his fellow military veteran Eddie Jacobson went into business by buying the lease for a haberdashery store in Kansas City selling men's clothing. The start-up costs were mostly financed by Truman, who sold off his share of the family farm together with the farm equipment. The Truman and Jacobson store was inspired by their successful experience running the regimental canteen in 1917 and 1918. After they opened the store in November 1919, their comrades from the 129th Field Artillery were regular customers. Moreover, the store was in a fashionable part of town, and the economic tailwinds following the First World War ensured that business was booming. Truman remained an officer in the Army Reserve, and in 1920 he was involved in organizing a Reserve Officers Association in Kansas City, which led to the creation of other such bodies throughout the country and the establishment of a federal organization 2 years later. In 1921, with the American Legion due to hold its first national convention in Kansas City, Truman served as vice chairman of the Committee on Decorations and reached out to businesses all over the city to provide flags to welcome the dignitaries, who included General Pershing, Marshal Foch of France, and British Admiral Sir David Beatty. While the convention was a major success in 1921, the American economy crashed as economic turmoil in Europe caused American exports to collapse, causing prices to plunge. Truman and Jacobson's inventory was now worth a fraction of the $30,000 it was initially valued at, and the store closed in April 1922. The two business partners struggled to pay back a loan from Security State Bank. However, while Jacobson was forced to declare bankruptcy in 1925, Truman was immune from bankruptcy proceedings, as he had already been elected to public office for the first time by that point. At the time of the failure of the haberdashery, Harry Truman was approaching 40 and had spent his adult life doing a variety of jobs without any particular direction or great success. In the summer of 1921, with the business already in dire straits, he had been visited by Jim Pendergast, a fellow veteran from the 129th Artillery. Jim was accompanied by his father, Michael, who ran the Democratic Party machine in Jackson County as a surrogate for his brother, Thomas, who controlled the Kansas City government. The Pendergasts were looking for a candidate to run in the east of Jackson County in 1922, one who could defeat the candidates of two rivals, Miles Bulger and Joseph Shannon. Truman appealed to the Pendergasts as somebody who could appear independent of the Pendergasts and whose farming background and military service during the war would be electoral assets. During the primary campaign, Truman avoided attaching himself to the Pendergasts too closely, and they only endorsed his candidacy at a late stage. He spoke at campaign events all over eastern Jackson County, though he was not a talented orator, and even his supporters claimed to have fallen asleep during his speeches. On election night, Truman was fewer than 80 votes ahead of Shannon's candidate, and his team had to stop attempts by his rival to stuff ballot boxes to get over the line. The November general election was more straightforward, and Truman received more than 9,000 votes compared to just over 6,000 for his Republican opponent in what was then a firmly blue state. Truman's term as a representative in the east of Jackson County from January 1923 to January 1925 launched a political career that would culminate in the presidency just over 2 decades later. As part of the Pendergast machine, Truman obtained an invaluable insight into the Machiavellian world of machine politics, working alongside Western Judge Henry McElroy, a fellow Pendergast man, to outmaneuver the presiding judge, Elihu Hayes, who had the backing of the Shannon faction in the county. The pair then set their sights on Bulger, who had founded an orphanage which had somehow cost the vast sum of $165,000 to house 60 children, including more than $1,000 on a bronze plaque at its entrance bearing his name. Truman and McElroy pressed for an investigation into this spending and found that the interiors had been decorated with marble and wood panelling, extravagances that could not be justified. A subsequent audit discovered that during Bulger's 8 years as presiding judge, the county's deficit had increased from just $117 to $1.2 million. Despite these revelations, Truman failed to gain re-election. For the next 2 years, he took on several odd jobs to support his family, having welcomed the birth of his only child, Mary Margaret Truman, in February 1924. By January 1927, Truman was back in office. While he worked closely with Tom Prendergast and gave supporters the government jobs they had been promised by the local party machine, Truman maintained a degree of independence and developed a reputation for honesty and fair dealing. He sought to eliminate corruption as much as possible, but he privately recognized that his fellow political operators had to have a small slice of any deal to make it worthwhile, though he did not take a penny himself. Truman's major accomplishment during his 8 years as presiding judge between 1927 and 1935 was an ambitious infrastructure program. He also initiated a secret bidding process for contracts to limit corruption. Through this, he added over 300 miles to the county's existing road network of 1,100 miles and was responsible for remodeling the courthouse in Independence along the lines of Philadelphia's Independence Hall, as well as building a new courthouse in Kansas City in a modern Art Deco style. After 8 years in local politics, Truman set his sights on higher office. In January 1934, he informed Pendergast that he wanted to run for the House of Representatives for Missouri's 4th District, covering eastern Jackson County and parts of Kansas City. Pendergast instead suggested a run for the U.S. Senate, though Truman believed that the boss wanted to be rid of him, since local county officials rarely made it straight to the Senate without a stint in the House of Representatives first. He was wrong in this initial assessment, though. By 1934, Pendergast was effectively in control of the entire state of Missouri, but he wanted a Senate candidate to counterbalance Bennett Clark, whose father, Champ Clark, had been the party boss in St. Louis. Pendergast offered the seat to 4 or 5 other candidates before arriving at Truman, whom he recognized had little name recognition. He was persuaded by Jackson County Party Chairman James Aylward that the machine controlled enough votes, and on the 13th of May 1934, Aylward and Jim Pendergast convinced Truman to run. He travelled from county to county and fought a tough campaign against his 2 rivals, Jacob Milligan, endorsed by Clark, and Congressman John Cochran of St. Louis. There were few policy differences between the 3 men, all of whom supported President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal policies to stimulate the economy during the Great Depression. While Cochran could claim to be independent of the party machines, Truman emphasized his war record and his farming experience, which won him considerable support among the rural counties. Thanks to Pendergast mobilizing the vote in Kansas City, Truman won the Democratic primary by 40,000 votes and easily defeated the Republican candidate in the November general election. When he took up his Senate seat in Washington, D.C. in January 1935, Truman received a cold reception. He was nicknamed the Senator from Pendergast by fellow Democrats, and although he admired President Roosevelt, Harry was only granted a 15-minute meeting with him, which took 5 months to acquire in the first place. Truman did not deliver his first speech on the Senate floor until 1937, and spoke rarely during his senatorial career. Unlike his colleague, Bennett Clark, who regularly voted against Roosevelt's agenda, Truman was loyal to the president and voted for most of the New Deal legislation. While he hoped for a seat on the Military Affairs Committee, he had to settle for the Interstate Commerce Committee. In this, Truman benefited from his experience with road infrastructure in Jackson County, though the committee's remit also covered railways, shipping, and the fledgling aviation industry. He was appointed to a subcommittee on aviation and sponsored a bill to create a Civil Aeronautics Board under the president's control. Truman's work on the Civil Aeronautics Act of 1938 fed into the transportation bill that he co-sponsored with his friend Burton Wheeler, Democratic senator from Montana. The pair had to balance a number of competing interests, particularly between rail and inland water transport. Truman and Wheeler both came from rural states where farmers blamed railroad executives for charging excessive prices for the transport of their goods to the major markets on the coasts. In 1937, Truman and Wheeler brought railroad executives to testify before the committee and highlighted how they were using profits to pay dividends while cutting jobs and neglecting maintenance and upgrades. Truman and Wheeler were careful not to tip the scales too far in favor of water transport, and their bill aimed to ensure fair competition among different modes of transport by bringing water carriers under the remit of the Interstate Commerce Commission. The Wheeler Transportation Act was passed in September 1940 after Truman had narrowly won the Democratic primaries by 1% of the vote. Truman's difficulties resulted from the collapse of the Pendergast machine. Tom Pendergast was in poor health and developed a gambling addiction that caused him to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars on horse races, compelling him to take larger bribes to remain afloat. During the 1936 election for governor, despite there being little opposition, Pendergast engaged in outrageous vote rigging on behalf of Lloyd Stark and produced more votes than eligible voters. Once in office, Stark turned against his benefactor, while President Roosevelt supported his efforts to break the Pendergast machine. Truman was genuinely unaware of the full extent of Pendergast's corruption and defended him on the Senate floor. He was astonished later when the full facts came out after Pendergast was indicted by a grand jury in April 1939 for accepting a $750,000 bribe to support a favorable settlement for 14 insurance companies. Within weeks, Pendergast was in prison and his political machine in Missouri collapsed. As the 1940 elections dawned, Roosevelt supported Stark's bid for Truman's Senate seat and offered the latter a lifetime appointment on the Interstate Commerce Commission. Truman defiantly refused, but faced an uphill struggle against the governor. To his initial confusion, one of Truman's aides encouraged District Attorney Morris Milligan, who had played a key part in bringing down the Pendergast machine, to enter the race. This split the anti-corruption vote, and last-minute support from his senatorial colleague, Bennett Clark, enabled Truman to win the nomination with votes from St. Louis. Then, in November 1940, Truman defeated his Republican opponent in the general election. In the same elections, Roosevelt was elected to an unprecedented third term as president, there being no constitutional impediment to doing so prior to the passage of the 22nd Amendment in 1951. Roosevelt's extraordinary assent to a third term was justified on the basis of the political emergency which the country faced. The Second World War had broken out in Europe in September 1939. While Roosevelt promised to stay out of the conflict, the fall of France to Nazi Germany in June 1940 encouraged the administration to launch a rearmament program. Truman was glad to see that Missouri was one of the beneficiaries of the rearmament program, but was keen to ensure that money was being well spent. On a personal inspection tour of the army camps, he found that contractors were incentivized to charge high rates, while small businesses were prevented from bidding for contracts. He also clashed with Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, about rates of ship production, and was a frequent critic of the War Production Board created in January 1942, a month after the US entered the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Truman helped to ensure that industrial production increased to meet wartime demand by the end of 1943. Despite his complaints about federal government agencies, Truman remained on cordial terms with Roosevelt, who was preparing to run for a fourth presidential term in 1944 despite his failing health. Senior Democratic Party figures believed that the president would not survive another 4 years and wanted Roosevelt to ditch his vice president, Henry Wallace, whom they considered too left-wing. In early 1944, Roosevelt was convinced to drop Wallace from the ticket. The chairman of the Democratic National Committee was Robert Hennigan from St. Louis, who supported Truman's re-election to the Senate in 1940. Hennigan was among those who now persuaded Roosevelt to accept Truman as his running mate in July. The president did not make his endorsement public, and two other vice-presidential candidates, including Wallace, believed they had Roosevelt's support heading into the Democratic Convention in Chicago. When Truman first heard that his name was being considered for vice president earlier in the year, he told a friend to let it be known that he did not wish to be considered, fearing that the press might discover he had been paying his wife a salary of $4,500 out of the Senate payroll since 1941 in order to support the family's finances. Truman was only informed that he was the president's preferred choice on the 19th of July in Chicago. After some initial hesitation, Roosevelt called into a meeting of party leaders to say, "Well, you tell him if he wants to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of a war, that's his responsibility." Faced with this ultimatum, Truman reluctantly fell in line and accepted the nomination. On the 18th of August, 1944, Truman met Roosevelt for lunch at the White House, where the latter admitted, "Harry, I'm not a well man, and we cannot be sure of my future." Truman accepted the ailing president's advice not to fly and campaigned across the country in a railroad car. Roosevelt easily won re-election in November, and Truman was sworn in as vice president on the 20th of January 1945. As vice president, Truman's power was limited, as the office of vice president has only become more significant in modern times, it having a largely ceremonial function for much of US history. Truman carried out his functions as President of the Senate and otherwise recognized that he might have to step up to the presidency at any moment if Roosevelt's health declined further. It was not surprising when, on the afternoon of the 12th of April 1945, he was urgently summoned to the White House and greeted by the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who informed him of her husband's passing. Chief Justice Harlan Stone and other senior members of the cabinet were hastily summoned, and just after 7 in the evening, Harry S. Truman was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States. At just shy of his 61st birthday upon being sworn in, the new president was only 2 years younger than his late predecessor, though he was a much healthier man. The federal government had expanded considerably during the previous administration, but Roosevelt had been a hands-on president who did not like delegating to his cabinet secretaries. Truman quickly set about reorganizing the government, replacing 6 incumbent cabinet secretaries within the first 3 months, and appointing his own aides as senior White House staffers. His closest advisor was Press Secretary Charlie Ross, an old school friend who had worked as a journalist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. A few weeks after taking office, Truman reached out to Roosevelt's Republican predecessor, Herbert Hoover, and asked him to carry out a survey of world food supplies. In 1947, Truman unexpectedly turned to Hoover to chair the Commission on the Organization of the Executive Branch of Government. Hoover surprised Truman by producing proposals to improve the efficiency of government, which involved strengthening cabinet departments rather than following the Republican line by recommending the reduction of executive functions. Truman had come to the presidency when the Allies were on the brink of victory in Europe, and Germany had surrendered on the 8th of May 1945. America was still at war, though, against Japan, a power that was going to lose the war but had seemingly little intention of surrendering. Truman relied heavily on the advice of ambassadors and State Department officials when it came to formulating his foreign policy. Although the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union had been allies in defeating fascist Germany, the American foreign policy establishment was keen to ensure that the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, would abide by commitments to allow free elections in Eastern Europe. As a gesture of goodwill, Truman ordered the withdrawal of American troops from the Soviet zone of occupation in eastern Germany in June 1945. In July, he went to Germany for the Potsdam Conference and met Stalin and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The discussion focused on the fate of Eastern Europe and Poland in particular. While a Polish government in exile had operated from London during the war, the Soviet army occupied Poland on its way to Germany, and the British and Americans recognized the Polish government installed by the Soviets when Stalin agreed to appoint several non-communist ministers. Truman was often exasperated by Stalin's unwillingness to compromise, even as the Americans and British made concessions to the Soviets. Truman later recalled that when he spoke about how the Catholic Church would feel about a particular issue, Stalin shot back, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" The relationship between Truman and Stalin was far less cordial than that which Roosevelt had enjoyed with the Soviet leader. One wonders how the Cold War might have developed differently had it not been for the poor relationship between the two, as new tensions developed everywhere in the post-war world. On the 16th of July 1945, just after Truman had arrived in Potsdam in Germany, he received an update about the successful detonation of an atomic bomb in Alamogordo, in New Mexico, where the Manhattan Project had been carrying out its key work to develop such a weapon for several years. During a casual exchange with Stalin a week later, Truman mentioned that the US had just developed a weapon of, quote, unusual destructive force, with American troops still fighting the Japanese and dying in the Pacific. The bomb was being proposed as a means to end the war. During the summer of 1945, the US Air Force had already been firebombing Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians in the process, but the Japanese government seemed determined to fight until the bitter end. The American top brass were planning an invasion of the Japanese home islands, and estimates of expected American casualties ranged from 250,000 to 1.5 million, with many more Japanese lives lost. Although it was unclear how much damage the bomb would inflict, Truman and his advisers decided on balance that it was better to use the bomb and avoid the much greater loss of life that an amphibious invasion of the Japanese home islands would result in. While Truman was at Potsdam, the Americans threatened the Japanese with massive destruction if they did not surrender immediately. When the Japanese declined, the city of Hiroshima was bombed on the 6th of August, followed by the city of Nagasaki 3 days later. Meanwhile, the Soviets had declared war on Japan and invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria in northeastern China. A combination of both factors led Emperor Hirohito of Japan to agree to surrender less than a week after the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. On balance, Truman's use of the first bomb against Hiroshima was possibly warranted in order to avoid a continuation of the war and the much greater loss of life that an invasion of Japan would have required, but he might have given the Japanese more time to respond before sanctioning the use of a second against Nagasaki just 3 days later. By the end of the war, Truman's approval ratings stood above 80%. But within a year, it had fallen to 30. Even in his native Missouri, Truman had done little to placate the media, and his poor relationship with the press led to criticisms about the caliber of his government appointees at a time when the print media was far more powerful than it is today. The main priority on the domestic front was to demobilize, bring the troops back home and return the US economy to a peacetime footing. These were not straightforward tasks, and many US troops would remain stationed in Germany, Japan, and other regions until the end of the 1940s. On the economic front, wartime rationing led to a large pool of excess savings, threatening to flood the economy and fuel inflation. Pressure from unions and businesses led Congress to weaken the powers of the wartime Office of Price Administration, and prices rose sharply after June 1946. That same year, Truman faced strike action from auto workers and steel workers, and by the time a settlement was reached with them, railroad workers and miners went on strike. While Truman eventually forced the mine workers to back down, the Democrats lost badly in the midterm elections as the Republicans took control of both houses of Congress. Foreign policy remained central to US government activity during this period. In March 1946, while the Soviets were replacing coalition governments in Eastern Europe with communist ones, Truman invited Winston Churchill to deliver a speech in Fulton, Missouri, where the former British Prime Minister warned concerning Europe, quote, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. he urged an alliance to confront the threat of Soviet expansion. Churchill's speech came shortly after the long telegram sent by George Kennan, the American chargé d'affaires in Moscow, who argued that Soviet designs on Eastern Europe, as well as Greece, Turkey and Iran, were an extension of Russian imperial policy that predated the revolution of 1917. Truman recognized that the US could not engage in direct conflict with the Soviet Union and adopted a policy of containment. This approach, which came to be known as the Truman Doctrine in March 1947, guided American foreign policy during the Cold War. In Asia, this meant supporting the Chinese nationalists in the civil war that had resumed there once the Japanese were defeated. In Europe, it entailed supporting reconstruction of a continent devastated by war, the idea being that American finance would create jobs for Germans, Greeks and Turks and win them over to the US side in the developing Cold War. This policy was soon spearheaded by the new Secretary of State George Marshall. After his appointment in January 1947, Marshall quickly launched a $13 billion program known officially as the European Recovery Act, but better known as the Marshall Plan, which provided financial aid to Greece and Turkey in particular, and drew them into the American camp. In June 1948, when Stalin closed off land access to West Berlin, Truman sent British and American aircraft to supply the Anglo-American occupation zone. The Berlin airlift saved West Berlin from communist occupation, and Stalin abandoned the blockade in April 1949. The same month, Truman oversaw the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, bringing together the United States, Canada, and 10 European countries in a defensive alliance directed against the Soviet Union. NATO remains the most powerful military alliance ever assembled in human history. Truman faced an uphill battle in the 1948 presidential election, and the administration's perceived failures were encapsulated in the popular quip, "To err is Truman." Despite his lack of popularity, Truman won the nomination at the Democratic National Convention in July with his running mate, Senator Alben Barkley of Kentucky. The Republican challenger was Governor Thomas Dewey of New York, who had already run against Roosevelt in 1944, but who had a much better prospect of winning in peacetime. Dewey was the overwhelming favorite, especially as the Democrats were assailed from left and right by former Vice President Henry Wallace as the Progressive Party candidate and by Governor Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, who represented the conservative States' Rights Democratic Party. Truman fought an effective campaign by portraying Wallace as a communist sympathizer, blaming the Republican Congress for undermining his efforts to stand up for freedom and democracy in Europe, and promoting his own claims as heir to Roosevelt's legacy. Although he was no orator, Truman attracted enthusiastic crowds at his campaign stops and remained optimistic about his prospects. As the returns came in over the night of the 2nd of November 1948 and into the morning of the 3rd, Truman and the Democrats were doing much better than anticipated. Ultimately, Truman was declared the winner at 9:30 in the morning, having carried the key states of California, Texas, and Florida, while the Democrats regained both houses of Congress. The pro-Republican Chicago Daily Tribune, which went to print when Dewey was still expected to win, published the headline, "Dewey Defeats Truman." The president posed with a copy of the newspaper in the morning for the press photographers. Truman had come to office with an ambitious domestic program which included full employment, a program of public works and improvements to housing, healthcare and education. Truman revived the package and called it his Fair Deal in an effort to echo Roosevelt's New Deal. With the backing of a Democratic Congress, Truman secured passage of the Social Security Act of 1950, which almost doubled the minimum wage from 40 to 75 cents an hour. However, the majority of Truman's domestic program, from agricultural reform to health care and education, were voted down by Congress after pressure from lobbyists. Truman also promoted civil rights, and in a message to Congress from February 1948, he demanded an end to segregation on interstate transportation and protection of black voting rights. While he had little support in the Democratic-controlled Congress, at a time when the political map of America was the direct inverse of what it is today, and the Democrats' base was in the southern states, he still took steps to desegregate the Army via executive order and encouraged his Attorney General, Tom Clark, to act against segregation in the courts. Truman's record on civil liberties was mixed. He supported Clark's refusal to give FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover permission to conduct wiretaps, but his presidency also saw the inception of the Second Red Scare and McCarthyism in America, though Truman himself was appalled by Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy's unsubstantiated allegations of communist activity against government officials. There was little he could do about it after the Republicans regained control of Congress in 1950. The virulence of anti-communist opinion in the United States was partly the response to further foreign and defense policy setbacks. In February 1949, Truman admitted to David Lilienthal, the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, that the existence of American nuclear weapons deterred the Soviet takeover of the European continent. A successful Soviet nuclear test in late August 1949 neutralized this strategic advantage and forced the US to rapidly increase its stockpile of nuclear weapons. Just over a month later, on the 1st of October 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China in Beijing after the US-backed nationalists had retreated to Taiwan, abandoning the Chinese mainland to the communists. Although Truman had envisaged a strong China to counter Soviet influence, this had proved impossible in the face of the extraordinary corruption and lack of character displayed by the nationalist leaders going back to the days of the Second World War. Most US financial aid had simply been stolen by the nationalists, and eventually Truman took the decision to reduce US support for them. Truman now focused on preserving US influence in the Philippines and Japan as the main bulwarks against communist expansion in Asia. He believed that South Korea would soon come under the control of communist North Korea, and in the late 1940s seemed unwilling to engage in the kind of spending and military support which would be needed to keep South Korea in the American camp in the Cold War. The belief that the Americans would not intervene directly on the Korean peninsula encouraged North Korea's Soviet-backed dictator, Kim Il-sung, to invade the South in force on the 25th of June 1950. The scale of the operation surprised Truman, who concluded that Kim had Stalin's full support and that his actions signaled the beginning of a Soviet campaign to gain world domination. Truman believed that the credibility of the United Nations, an institution which had been formed at the very end of the Second World War, through which the victorious Allied powers aspired to oversee a peaceful world order in its aftermath, was at stake, and he sought a UN mandate for military intervention. As the Soviets were boycotting the UN in protest that China's seat at the UN Security Council was still held by the Chinese nationalists on Taiwan, Truman received authorization to take action, and on the 7th of July, the UN Expeditionary Force in Korea was placed under American command. American troops had been in action since early July, but by early August, UN forces were forced back to the Busan perimeter, a defensive line around the port of Busan on the southeastern tip of the Korean peninsula. With North Korea on the cusp of victory, General Douglas MacArthur landed 40,000 men behind enemy lines at Incheon in mid-September, captured Seoul, and trapped the North Korean army in a pincer movement. Encouraged by his success, MacArthur crossed the 38th parallel into North Korea with Truman's backing in late September. MacArthur was now poised to overrun the whole Korean peninsula, and the Chinese Communist government feared that he would cross the Yalu River, which separated Korea from China. Hence, on the 25th of November 1950, 300,000 men of China's People's Liberation Army attacked MacArthur near the Yalu. UN forces were forced back south. In the new year, the US UN forces stabilized the front and began a counterattack south of Seoul. In March 1951, Truman was prepared to make peace with a demarcation line at the 38th parallel, but MacArthur drew up his own peace conditions and threatened to expand the war into China. An infuriated Truman dismissed the general on the 10th of April. After peace talks began in July 1951, the US maintained 6 army divisions in Korea, where fighting continued to break out sporadically across the 38th parallel. Truman also agreed to send military aid to NATO to strengthen Western Europe at this time, following the formal creation of democratic West Germany and communist East Germany. By the end of the Truman presidency, the US armed forces were in a position to back up the nation's foreign policy. Truman received little credit, and by November 1951 his approval ratings had plunged to 23%. He was in his late 60s and continued to be plagued with allegations of corruption in the White House. A major target was General Harry Vaughan, an old friend from the 129th Field Artillery who served as Truman's military aide after returning to duty during the Second World War, and admitted to receiving bribes in exchange for access to the president in 1951. While Truman was not personally responsible for rampant corruption in the White House, and later reflected that his administration was no more corrupt than those that came before, his unwillingness to abandon his friends damaged his own reputation. Although he was still eligible to seek another presidential term in the 1952 election, having only served one full term through election, Truman chose not to run. The Democratic nominee, Governor Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, was keen to distance himself from Truman and faced an uphill challenge against the Republican nominee, the war hero General Dwight Eisenhower, who was elected president. Eisenhower had attacked Truman's failure to secure peace in Korea. He soon pushed through the armistice of Panmunjom on the 27th of July 1953, 6 months after the end of Truman's presidency. This established a ceasefire between North and South Korea, though the two nations technically remain at war with one another over 70 years later. After leaving office, Truman returned to Independence, Missouri, where he began working on his memoirs. They were released in 1955 in 2 volumes. The first, dealing with Truman's first year in office, the end of the war in Europe, the controversial use of nuclear weapons, and the beginning of the Cold War, and the second volume covering the remaining 7. The same year, construction work began on the Truman Presidential Library in Independence. From its completion in 1957 until 1964, Truman served as the library's main attraction, working from its office and giving visitors guided tours. He envisaged the institution as a study center for the American presidency and enjoyed giving lectures in the auditorium to schoolchildren. Truman maintained an interest in politics, but thought little of his successor, Eisenhower, who he believed had been captured by Republican business lobbyists. His estimation of Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, was even lower, since the latter accused Truman of tolerating communists in government. In 1960, Truman was unenthusiastic about John F. Kennedy's candidacy for the Democratic Party, regarding the young Massachusetts senator as a playboy who owed his success to his father, Joseph Kennedy's wealth. Nevertheless, after Kennedy won the nomination and became president, Truman rallied behind him, and he and Bess were glad to be invited to the White House during the winter of 1961. Truman was shocked by Kennedy's assassination in November 1963. His successor, Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society reform agenda echoed much of Truman's Fair Deal, and on the 30th of July 1965, Johnson went to Missouri to sign Medicare into law at the Truman Library, where he presented the former president Medicare card number 1. Truman's own health was deteriorating by then after a fall in October 1964, and he no longer made regular appearances at the library. His final years were spent quietly in Missouri, where he died on the 26th of December 1972 at the age of 88. He was buried in the courtyard of the Truman Library after a 5-day state funeral which he had approved several years earlier, commenting that he wanted, quote, "a damn fine show. I just hate that I'm not going to be around to see it." Harry Truman was a most unusual U.S. president. His path to power was about as unconventional as one could get. Most 20th century U.S. presidents have come from privileged backgrounds and have progressed from Ivy League colleges to jobs in law, business or academia into politics, typically serving several terms in the Senate or as governors of a state before acquiring their party's nomination for the presidency. Truman did not enter politics until he was in his late 30s, coming from a modest background in the American Midwest, where he had struggled to eke out a living as a farmer and running a clothes shop. Thereafter, his ascent was peculiar. He got into the Senate through his connections to the Pendergast party machine in Missouri, and after a fairly unremarkable career as a senator, was rapidly promoted to become vice president and then president during the Second World War. Yet, while Truman's ascent was unusual, he soon became one of the most consequential and controversial presidents in U.S. history. It was under Truman's watch that the decision was taken to use the only nuclear weapons ever deployed as conventional weapons of war, that the Cold War began and was shaped, and that the Korean War was fought. Nobody could be involved in these events and not arouse strong opinions about his decisions, and many people view Truman as a villain in American history today. The decision to use 2 nuclear weapons in 1945 was probably unjustified, but there would have been few dissenting voices among the generals in 1945 when they debated the validity of using the first to avoid a ground invasion of Japan. Truman will perhaps be remembered for the decision to use a second, 3 days later, above all others. What do you think of Harry Truman? Was he an honest man who served his country well in uniform and in office, or was he tainted by his close association with the Pendergasts and other corrupt officials? Do you believe he was justified in using nuclear weapons to avoid further bloodshed? And could he have done more to prevent the expansion of communism in Europe and Asia? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.